One night, one drink, one kiss that woke the monster. He tried to forget. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Marcus Sterling's penthouse office, each drop exploding like tiny grenades against the glass. 37 floors above downtown Seattle, he stood motionless in his tailored Tom Ford suit, watching the city blur into watercolor streaks of neon and headlights. The scotch in his hand had gone warm an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. He hadn't noticed much of anything lately, except the hollow ache that had taken residence in his chest 6 months ago. "Mr. Sterling." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, hesitant and apologetic. "The car is waiting downstairs. You're already 20 minutes late for the charity gala." Marcus closed his eyes and pressed the bridge of his nose between his fingers. The Emerald City Children's Foundation Gala. Another evening of forced smiles, practiced conversations, and writing checks that meant nothing to him, but everything to his carefully cultivated image as Seattle's most eligible bachelor and philanthropic tech mogul. "Tell them I'm not feeling well," he said into the intercom. "So you're the keynote speaker. There are 300 people waiting, including the mayor and—" "I said tell them I'm not feeling well, Rebecca." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus had built sterling tech from a cramped garage in Bellevue to a billion-dollar empire. But tonight he felt like that 22-year-old kid again, lost and angry and drowning in emotions he couldn't control. "Very well, sir. Should I reschedule your morning meetings?" "No, I'll be fine tomorrow." The lie came easily. He'd been telling the same lie for months. Marcus set the scotch down on his mahogany desk and loosened his tie. The framed photo next to his computer caught his attention. Him and his ex-fiancée, Catherine, at last year's Tech Innovation Awards, her perfect smile radiant under the camera flash, his arm around her waist possessively. She looked like she belonged in his world of galas and board meetings and seven-figure deals. She had belonged until she decided she couldn't handle the real him anymore. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Catherine's voice, cold and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. "You're not the man I fell in love with, Marcus. You're angry all the time, closed off. It's like you're wearing a mask, and I don't know who you really are underneath." She'd been wrong about one thing. He wasn't wearing a mask, he was the mask. The real Marcus Sterling had died 15 years ago in a hospital room in Portland, along with his younger brother, Danny, and any capacity he'd had for genuine human connection. His phone buzzed on the desk. A text from his therapist. "Remember what we discussed about isolating yourself? Sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of your head and into the world." Dr. Martinez meant well, but she didn't understand. The world was full of people who wanted things from him: money, connections, pieces of his success. Easier to stay in his tower, safe from the complications that came with caring about anyone else. But as he looked around his empty office, surrounded by awards and achievements that felt as cold as the Seattle rain, something in his chest cracked. Maybe Catherine had been right. Maybe he had become a monster, feeding on isolation and control while the part of him capable of real emotion withered away. "Screw it," he muttered, grabbing his jacket from the back of his chair. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood outside Molly's pub in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, rain soaking through his expensive suit. He'd driven here without really thinking, muscle memory guiding him to the dive bar he used to frequent in his early 20s, back when he was still human enough to drink beer with strangers and laugh at terrible jokes. The contrast between the upscale charity gala he was supposed to be attending and this weathered brick building with its neon Rainier beer sign couldn't have been starker. Through the rain-streaked windows, he could see a crowd of 20-somethings in flannel shirts and ripped jeans, nursing cheap beers and arguing about the Seahawks' chances this season. He almost turned around. What was he doing here? Marcus Sterling didn't belong in dive bars anymore. He belonged in boardrooms and penthouse restaurants, surrounded by people who spoke in quarterly projections and market analyses. But then the door opened, and a woman stumbled out, laughing as she tried to juggle her purse, a cardigan, and an umbrella that refused to cooperate. She was maybe 5'4" with wild auburn hair, escaping from a messy bun, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. When she looked up and caught sight of him standing there like a drowned executive, her laughter died. "Oh, wow, you look like you've had a rough night." Her voice carried a slight accent, Not quite southern, but somewhere warm and musical that made him think of summer evenings and front porch conversations. Marcus looked down at himself. His suit was soaked, his hair plastered to his head, and he probably looked exactly like what he was, a man having some kind of breakdown in the rain outside a dive bar. "Something like that," he said. She studied his face for a moment, and he braced himself for recognition. His photo had been on the cover of Seattle Business Journal 3 times this year, and his face was plastered on billboards all over the city, advertising Sterling Tech's latest product launch. But she just nodded sympathetically. "Well, you're definitely in the right place for rough nights. Molly's has the cheapest whiskey and the best jukebox in the city. Plus Jerry," she gestured toward the bar, "makes a mean grilled cheese that can cure almost anything." "Thanks," Marcus said, surprised by her kindness to a complete stranger. "I think I needed to hear that." "No problem. I'm Emma, by the way." She extended a hand that was small and paint-stained, with calluses that spoke of work more physical than pushing papers or typing on keyboards. "Marcus." He shook her hand, noting how warm her skin felt against his rain-chilled fingers. "Well, Marcus, whatever brought you out here in the rain looking like a lost CEO, I hope Molly's can help." She grinned at him, apparently not realizing how accurate her assessment was. "I'd stay and chat, but I've got to get home to my daughter. She's with my neighbor Mrs. Chen, and if I'm too late, she'll make me listen to another lecture about responsible parenting while eating her homemade dumplings." It's a fate worse than death. There was something about the way she said it, fond exasperation mixed with genuine affection, that made Marcus smile for the first time in weeks. A real smile, not the practiced expression he wore for cameras and board meetings. "Sounds terrible," he said. "The worst. Have a good night, Marcus, and hey." She touched his arm briefly, the contact sending an unexpected jolt of warmth through him. "Whatever it is, it'll get better. It always does." Then she was gone, hurrying down the sidewalk under her rebellious umbrella, leaving Marcus standing in the rain with the ghost of her touch on his arm, and something that felt dangerously close to hope stirring in his chest. Inside Molly's pub, the air was thick with the smell of hops and fried food, and someone had loaded the jukebox with classic rock that competed with the din of conversation and laughter. Marcus found an empty stool at the end of the bar and ordered a whiskey. Neat. The bartender, presumably Jerry, was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and arms covered in tattoos that looked like they came with stories. He set the drink down and studied Marcus with the assessing gaze of someone who'd seen every type of drunk and heartbreak that could walk through his doors. "You look like a man with problems," Jerry said conversationally. "Don't we all?" "Fair point, but most people don't show up here wearing suits that cost more than my car." Marcus looked around the bar, suddenly self-conscious. His Armani suit stood out like a billboard among the casual clothes and work boots of the other patrons. A few people were glancing his way, though whether from curiosity or annoyance, he couldn't tell. "Maybe I should go," he said. "Nah." Jerry refilled his glass without being asked. Money problems, relationship problems, existential crisis, doesn't matter what kind of problems you got. Whiskey treats them all the same. Marcus took a sip of his drink and felt the burn settle in his chest. "What if the problem is that you've forgotten how to be a decent human being?" Jerry laughed, a rough sound that somehow managed to be comforting. "Brother, half the people in here are trying to figure out the same thing. The other half gave up trying years ago." "Which half are you?" "Still trying. Some days are better than others." Jerry leaned against the bar, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "You know what I've learned in 23 years of tending bar? The people who ask that question are usually the ones worth saving." They drank in companionable silence for a while, the noise of the bar washing over them like white noise. Marcus found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months. There were no expectations here, no one trying to get something from him, no carefully orchestrated conversations about market projections or strategic partnerships. "Jerry!" A woman's voice cut through the din, bright and exasperated. "Did you give Table 6 the loaded nachos they ordered, or are you holding them hostage again?" Marcus looked up to see Emma pushing through the crowd, now wearing an apron over her band t-shirt and balancing 2 plates of food on her arms. She moved with practiced ease through the packed bar, dodging elbows and beer glasses, with the grace of someone who'd been doing this for a while. "She works here?" Marcus asked Jerry. "Emma?" "Yeah, she's one of my best servers. Been here about 2 years, ever since she moved to Seattle with her kid. Good girl, hard worker. Tips everyone else out when she has a good night." Marcus watched Emma deliver the plates to a table of rowdy college kids, laughing at something one of them said, before moving on to check on her other tables. She hadn't noticed him yet, but he found himself hoping she would. There was something magnetic about her energy, the way she seemed to find genuine joy in the chaos of the bar. "She's got a daughter," Jerry nodded, following Marcus's gaze. "Sophie. Cute as a button, smart as a whip. Emma brings her by sometimes on Sunday afternoons when it's slow. Kid does her homework at table 12 while Emma works. How old?" 7, I think. Maybe 8. Jerry gave Marcus a sharp look. "Why the interest?" Marcus realized he'd been staring and looked away, heat creeping up his neck. "Sorry, I ran into her outside. She seemed nice." "She is nice. Too nice, if you ask me. Always giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when they don't deserve it." Jerry's tone carried a warning that Marcus chose to ignore. "Marcus." Emma appeared at his elbow, genuine surprise in her voice. "You actually came in. How's the whiskey treating you?" "Better than expected," he said, and was surprised to realize it was true. The knot in his chest had loosened slightly, and for the first time in months he felt like he could breathe properly. "Good, Jerry's got the magic touch with broken hearts and wounded pride." She grinned at the bartender, who rolled his eyes but couldn't quite hide his affection for her. "Speaking of which, did Mrs. Patterson ever come back for her purse?" "Left it right there on table 4, Jerry said. "Woman's been coming here for 15 years, leaves her purse behind at least once a month. I'll drop it by her place tomorrow morning." Emma turned back to Marcus. "So what's your story? And don't say it's complicated. Everyone's story is complicated. That's what makes them interesting." Marcus found himself caught off guard by her directness. Most people in his social circle communicated through layers of subtext and carefully chosen words. Emma asked questions like she actually wanted to know the answers. "I'm supposed to be at a charity gala right now," he said, "giving a speech about the importance of community investment and social responsibility." "Supposed to be? What happened?" He gestured around the bar. This seemed more appealing than writing another check and making small talk about tax benefits. Emma studied his face with those perceptive eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing more than he intended to show. "You know what I think? I think you're probably one of those people who gives a lot of money to charities, but never actually gets his hands dirty helping people." The observation stung because it was accurate. Marcus donated millions every year to various causes, but it was all handled through his foundation's board of directors. He signed checks and attended galas, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually interacted with the people his money was supposed to help. "You're probably right," he said. "I don't say that to be mean," Emma continued, wiping down the bar around his glass. "It's just, money's great. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes what people need is someone to actually see them, you know, to treat them like they matter. And you do that?" "I try. It's not always easy, and I definitely don't always succeed. But I figure if I'm going to be serving people drinks and food, I might as well try to serve them a little humanity too." Before Marcus could respond, a crash came from across the bar, followed by loud cursing. A heavily intoxicated man in a Seahawks jersey had knocked over a table, sending glasses and plates crashing to the floor. He was swaying on his feet, pointing an accusatory finger at another patron. "You think you're better than me?" the drunk man slurred. "Just 'cause you got some fancy job downtown?" Emma sighed. "That's Brad. He comes in every Thursday, drinks too much, and picks fights with anyone who looks like they went to college." She started toward the commotion. "Jerry, call him a cab. I'll handle this." "Emma, wait," Jerry called after her, but she was already crossing the bar, moving toward a situation that could turn ugly fast. Marcus watched as she approached the drunk man, her hands raised peacefully. He couldn't hear what she was saying over the noise of the bar, but her body language was calm, non-threatening. She was speaking to Brad like he was a human being worth listening to, not just a problem to be removed. For a moment it seemed to work. Brad's aggressive posture relaxed slightly, and he lowered his pointing finger. But then the man he'd been yelling at, a guy in a button-down shirt who looked like he probably did work downtown, made the mistake of laughing. "Yeah, listen to the waitress, buddy. Maybe she can get you some coffee to go with that attitude." Brad's face flushed red. He shoved Emma aside harder than necessary, sending her stumbling backward, and lunged toward the other man. Emma tried to catch herself, but her foot caught on a chair leg, and Marcus watched in slow motion as she fell, her head striking the corner of the next table with a sickening thud. The bar fell silent except for the jukebox, which continued playing Sweet Child O' Mine with oblivious cheerfulness. Emma lay motionless on the floor, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut above her left eyebrow. Marcus was moving before he realized it, shoving through the crowd that had gathered around her. All his carefully maintained control, the emotional walls he'd built over 15 years, cracked open like an eggshell. The sight of Emma hurt and unconscious triggered something primal and protective that he'd thought was dead. "Call 911, he barked at Jerry, dropping to his knees beside Emma. His hands shook as he checked for a pulse at her neck, relief flooding through him when he found it, strong and steady. "Emma? Emma? Can you hear me?" He carefully tilted her head, checking for signs of serious injury. The cut on her forehead was bleeding but didn't look deep. More concerning was the way she wasn't responding to his voice. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Marcus stood and turned toward Brad, who was still swaying drunkenly, apparently confused by the sudden silence. The rage that swept through Marcus was white-hot and terrifying, a monster that had been sleeping in his chest for years, suddenly roaring to life. "Hey, man, I didn't mean to—" Marcus grabbed Brad by the front of his jersey and slammed him against the nearest wall. The drunk man's eyes went wide with sudden fear, apparently sobering enough to realize he was in serious trouble. "She was trying to help you, you worthless piece of garbage." Marcus's voice was deadly quiet, the tone he used in board meetings when someone had pushed him too far. "She was the only person in this bar who gave a damn about you, and you put her in the hospital." "Marcus!" Jerry's voice was sharp. "Let him go, the cops are on their way." But Marcus couldn't let go. All the anger he'd been carrying, all the rage and pain and guilt from months of watching his life fall apart, was focused on the man in his hands. This drunk stranger had hurt the one person who'd shown him genuine kindness in longer than he could remember, and every instinct he had was screaming for payback. "Marcus!" A weak voice from behind him cut through the red haze of his fury. "Marcus, please!" He looked over his shoulder to see Emma struggling to sit up, one hand pressed to the cut on her forehead. Her face was pale, and she looked shaky, but her eyes were alert and focused on him. "Please don't hurt him," she whispered. "He's drunk and stupid, but he's not evil. Just let him go." The request was so quintessentially Emma, hurt and bleeding, but still more concerned about preventing violence than seeking retribution, that Marcus felt something break apart in his chest. He released Brad, who slumped against the wall, looking like he might be sick. "Get out," Marcus told him, "before I change my mind." Brad stumbled toward the door without argument, probably not entirely sure what had just happened, but smart enough to leave before his luck ran out. The paramedics arrived 10 minutes later, by which time Emma was sitting in a chair with an ice pack pressed to her forehead, insisting she was fine, despite the obvious signs of a concussion. Marcus stayed close, feeling oddly protective and trying to ignore the concerned looks Jerry kept shooting his way. "Ma'am, we really recommend you come to the hospital for observation," one of the EMTs said after examining her. "Head injuries can be tricky, and you definitely have a concussion." "I can't," Emma said. "My daughter, I need to pick her up from my neighbors. She's expecting me." "Is there someone who can get her?" Marcus asked. "Someone you trust?" Emma looked at him with confusion, as if she'd forgotten he was there. The concussion was clearly affecting her thinking. "Mrs. Chen. She lives next door, but I can't ask her to keep Sophie overnight. She's 83 and—" "I'll take care of it," Marcus said, surprising himself. "Give me her number. I'll call and explain what happened. Make sure your daughter is safe for the night." "You don't even know me," Emma protested weakly. "I know enough." Marcus pulled out his phone. "What's Mrs. Chen's number?" The conversation with Mrs. Chen was exactly as Emma had predicted. a lecture about responsibility delivered in accented English, while the sound of something delicious sizzled in the background. But she agreed to keep Sophie overnight, and even offered to drive her to school in the morning if Emma wasn't feeling well enough. "Your neighbor sounds nice," Marcus told Emma as they waited for the paramedics to finish their paperwork. "She's the best. When we first moved here, she showed up with a casserole and a lecture about proper nutrition for growing children. Sophie adores her." Emma winced as she adjusted the ice pack. "I can't believe I'm going to miss her science fair project tomorrow. She's been working on it for weeks." "What's her project about?" "Solar energy. She built this little model house with solar panels that actually work. It's pretty impressive for a 7-year-old. Emma's voice was full of pride, and Marcus found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "She sounds smart. Too smart. Yesterday she asked me why rich people don't just give all their money to poor people if money doesn't buy happiness. Try explaining economic theory to a second grader." Marcus laughed, a real laugh that felt rusty from disuse. "What did you tell her?" "That sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be." Emma met his eyes, and there was something in her gaze that made him think she was talking about more than economics. The ride to Seattle General Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical questions. Emma dozed fitfully against Marcus's shoulder, while he found himself cataloguing everything he knew about her. Single mother, waitress, painter, if the stains on her hands were any indication. Kind enough to worry about a drunk who'd just sent her to the emergency room. She was nothing like the women he usually dated. Catherine had been polished and ambitious, with an MBA from Wharton and a 5-year plan that included marriage to someone who could advance her career in corporate law. The others before her had been variations on the same theme: beautiful, educated, successful women who understood his world and wanted to be part of it. Emma was different. She worked at a dive bar and worried about her elderly neighbor and raised a daughter who built solar panel houses. She'd probably never been to a charity gala in her life, and she definitely didn't care about quarterly projections or market shares. So why couldn't he stop thinking about her? At the hospital, Marcus found himself in the familiar position of using his name and connections to cut through red tape. A quiet word with the attending physician, a discreet mention of his family's foundation's generous donations to the hospital, and suddenly Emma was moved to a private room with the best neurological care the hospital could provide. "You didn't have to do that," Emma said when the doctor left, after promising to personally monitor her condition through the night. "Do what?" "Whatever you did to get me the VIP treatment. This is way too nice for someone with basic insurance and a bar fight head injury." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the visitor's chair. "I just wanted to make sure you got good care." "Why?" Emma studied his face with those perceptive eyes. "You don't know me. We met 3 hours ago outside a dive bar. Why do you care what happens to me?" It was a fair question, and Marcus didn't have a good answer. The truth was complicated, and probably wouldn't make sense to her. How could he explain that her kindness to a stranger in the rain had cracked something open in him that he'd thought was permanently sealed? That watching her get hurt had triggered a protective instinct he didn't know he still possessed? "Maybe I'm tired of not caring about anything," he said finally. Emma was quiet for a long moment. "What happened to you?" she asked softly. "What made you stop caring?" Marcus looked out the hospital room window at the Seattle skyline, lights twinkling like earthbound stars in the darkness. He'd never told the whole story to anyone, not even Dr. Martinez. But something about Emma, maybe the concussion, maybe the late hour, maybe the way she'd asked the question without judgment, made him want to try. "I had a younger brother," he began, and the words came easier than he'd expected. "Danny, he was 5 years younger than me and everything I wasn't. Funny, outgoing, everybody loved him. I was the serious one, always studying, always working. He was the one who made friends and played guitar and got invited to parties." Emma listened without interrupting, her attention complete, despite the pain medication making her eyelids heavy. "When I started my company, Danny was the first person I hired. Not because he was qualified, he wasn't, but because I wanted to share the success with him. I wanted us to build something together." Marcus's hands clenched into fists in his lap. He was 22, just graduated from college, full of ideas about changing the world. He believed in what we were doing. What happened? I worked him to death. The words came out flat and brutal. Literally. 80-hour weeks, constant pressure, impossible deadlines. I told myself it was necessary, that we were building something important. But the truth is, I was so obsessed with success, so terrified of failure, that I couldn't see what it was doing to him. Marcus closed his eyes, but that only made the memories more vivid. He started having headaches, bad ones. I told him it was stress, that he needed to push through it. When he finally went to the doctor, they found a brain tumor. Stage 4. The doctor said the stress and sleep deprivation might have accelerated its growth. Oh, Marcus. He died 6 weeks later. 6 weeks. We went from it's just stress to planning a funeral in 6 weeks. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at Emma, who was crying silently. The last thing he said to me was, "I'm sorry I let you down." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft beeping of medical equipment and the distant sounds of the hospital. Marcus had expected to feel worse after telling the story, but instead there was a strange sense of relief, like lancing an infected wound. "That's why you stopped caring," Emma said finally, "because caring hurt too much." Caring killed him. If I'd cared less about the company and more about him, maybe he'd still be alive. Or maybe he'd still have gotten sick. And you'd have lost him anyway. You can't know. Emma's voice was gentle but firm. What you can know is that he loved you enough to work himself to death for your dream. That's not nothing. It should have been my dream, not his. But it was his dream too, wasn't it? Otherwise he wouldn't have done it. Marcus considered this. Danny had been passionate about the work, especially in the early days. He'd stay late not because Marcus asked him to, but because he believed in what they were building. He'd been the one to suggest their first major pivot, the decision that had ultimately made Sterling Tech the success it was today. "I never thought about it that way," Marcus admitted. "Grief makes us stupid sometimes. It makes us rewrite history so we're the villain in every story." Emma reached over and took his hand, her fingers warm and paint-stained and real. "Maybe the real way to honor your brother is to care about things again, to let people in." Before Marcus could respond, Emma's eyes fluttered closed, the pain medication and exhaustion finally winning. He sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair and watched her sleep, her hand still holding his, and tried to remember the last time he'd felt this connected to another human being. His phone buzzed with text messages, Rebecca wondering where he was, board members asking about the missed gala, reporters wanting quotes about his unexpected absence. The outside world was calling, demanding his attention, reminding him of all the reasons he'd built walls around his heart in the first place. But for the first time in 15 years, Marcus ignored them all. He had somewhere more important to be. The next morning arrived grey and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched Marcus's mood as he sat in the hospital cafeteria, nursing his third cup of terrible coffee and watching the early shift of doctors and nurses grab breakfast before their rounds. He'd barely slept, dozing fitfully in the chair beside Emma's bed until a nurse had gently suggested he might be more comfortable in the waiting area. Emma was being discharged this morning, assuming her follow-up CT scan showed no complications from the concussion. The doctor had been cautiously optimistic, but Marcus couldn't shake the image of her lying motionless on the bar floor, or the way her hand had felt so fragile in his. "Mr. Sterling," a nurse appeared at his table, looking slightly starstruck. "Ms. Rodriguez is awake and asking for you." Marcus hurried back to Emma's room to find her sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. Someone, probably the same efficient staff member who'd been bringing her ice chips all night, had helped her wash the blood out of her hair and provided a clean hospital gown. The stark white made her skin look translucent, but her eyes were clear and focused. "Hey," she said, managing a small smile. "You look like you slept about as well as I did. How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but the doctor says I'll live, so there's that." Emma gestured to the chair beside her bed. "You didn't have to stay all night." "I wanted to." The words came out before Marcus could stop them, more honest than he'd intended. "I needed to know you were okay." Emma studied his face. And Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling she was seeing right through all his carefully maintained defenses. "You're not what I expected when I met you outside Molly's." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone softer, maybe. You looked so lost standing there in the rain." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But then last night when that guy pushed me, there was something different in your eyes. Something dangerous." Marcus looked away, shame creeping up his neck. "I'm sorry you saw that. I don't usually lose control like that." "Don't apologize. It was kind of amazing, actually. When was the last time you cared enough about something to get angry?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time? Before Danny died, certainly. Before he'd learned that caring about people just gave them the power to hurt you. "I don't remember," he said honestly. "Well, for what it's worth, it was nice to know someone had my back. Even if you are apparently some kind of secret badass under all that expensive tailoring." Before Marcus could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught their attention. A small voice was arguing with what sounded like a hospital receptionist. "But I know she's here. Mrs. Chen called me and told me what happened. I need to see my mom." Emma's face lit up, despite her obvious discomfort. "Sophie." Marcus watched from the doorway as a whirlwind in a Disney backpack and light-up sneakers burst into the room, followed by an elderly Asian woman carrying what appeared to be enough food to feed a small army. "Mom!" Sophie launched herself at the hospital bed with the reckless abandon of a 7-year-old who didn't understand why she needed to be careful. Emma caught her daughter and held her close, wincing slightly but smiling through the pain. "I'm okay, baby. Just a little bump on the head." "Mrs. Chen said some mean man hurt you, and you had to come to the hospital, and I was so scared." Sophie's words tumbled over each other, in the way of children trying to get everything out at once. "Hey, look at me." Emma cupped her daughter's face in her hands. "I'm fine, see, just a little cut, nothing that won't heal." Marcus found himself transfixed by the interaction. There was something so pure about the love between them, so uncomplicated. Sophie was a miniature version of her mother, with the same auburn hair and perceptive eyes, but where Emma carried herself with the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect disappointment, Sophie radiated the confidence of a child who'd never doubted she was loved. "Mrs. Chen brought dumplings," Sophie announced, apparently satisfied that her mother was indeed alive and well. "And she said I could skip school today to take care of you, but I told her I had to present my science project, and I've been working on it forever, and—" She stopped mid-sentence, noticing Marcus for the first time. "Who are you?" she asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood. Marcus stepped forward, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first board meeting 15 years ago. "I'm Marcus. I'm a friend of your mum's." Sophie studied him with Emma's perceptive eyes, clearly trying to figure out how her mother had acquired a friend who looked like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. "Are you rich?" "Sophie!" Emma's cheeks flushed pink. "You can't just ask people if they're rich." "Why not? You always tell me to be honest." Marcus found himself smiling despite the awkwardness of the question. "It's okay. And yes, I suppose I am." "Cool. Are you going to marry my mom?" The silence that followed was deafening. Emma looked like she wanted to disappear into her hospital bed while Mrs. Chen made a noise that might have been laughter or disapproval. It was hard to tell. "Sophie," Emma said weakly, "that's not how it works." "But you said when I asked why Daddy left that sometimes grown-ups care about each other and want to be together forever. And Marcus stayed here all night, so he must care about you." Out of the mouths of babes, Marcus thought. Sophie's logic was flawless, even if it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of adult relationships. The problem was that her innocent question had forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding all night. He did care about Emma, more than he'd cared about anyone in 15 years. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Sometimes grown-ups need more time to figure out their feelings," he said carefully. "But you're right that I care about your mom. She's pretty special." Sophie beamed at this answer. "She is special. She makes the best pancakes in the world, and she reads me stories in funny voices, and when I had bad dreams about monsters, she taught me how to catch them in a jar so they couldn't hurt me anymore." Marcus felt something twist in his chest at this glimpse into Emma and Sophie's life together. He tried to imagine Catherine teaching a child to catch monsters or making pancakes on weekend mornings, and couldn't. Emma was raising her daughter in a world of dive bars and elderly neighbors and homemade solutions to childhood fears, and somehow that seemed infinitely more valuable than all the privilege and advantages he could offer. "That does sound pretty special," he agreed. Mrs. Chen, who had been unpacking an impressive array of containers during this exchange, cleared her throat pointedly. "Emma needs rest, not visitors asking marriage questions. You—" She pointed at Marcus with a dumpling-laden chopstick. "You look like trouble. Too handsome, too rich. These always trouble." "Mrs. Chen," Emma protested, but the elderly woman waved her off. "I live 83 years. I know trouble when I see it. But—" She studied Marcus with sharp eyes. "You bring Emma to good hospital, stay all night. Maybe not complete waste of space." It was perhaps the most backhanded compliment Marcus had ever received, but coming from Mrs. Chen, it felt like a stamp of approval. "Thank you," he said gravely. "I think." Sophie had been following this adult conversation with the intense focus of a child, trying to decode the mysterious ways of grown-ups. "Are you trouble, Marcus?" Marcus looked at Emma, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The honest answer was yes, he probably was trouble. He was a man with more emotional baggage than most people could handle, a workaholic billionaire who'd forgotten how to form genuine human connections. Getting involved with him would complicate Emma's life in ways she probably couldn't imagine. But for the first time in 15 years, the possibility of being someone's trouble and having them be his didn't seem entirely terrible. "I might be," he said to Sophie, "but I'm trying to be the good kind of trouble." Sophie considered this seriously. "Like when I accidentally spilled paint on Mrs. Chen's flowers, but then we planted new ones together and they were even prettier." Something like that. "Okay then." Sophie turned to her mother. "Mom, I like him. Can we keep him?" Emma laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "It doesn't work that way, sweetheart. People aren't pets. But you're lonely sometimes, I can tell. And Marcus seems nice and he's rich, so maybe he could help us fix the car when it makes that scary noise." The casual mention of money troubles hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. He thought about Emma walking to work in the rain because her car was unreliable, about the paint stains on her hands that suggested she was an artist working a service job to pay the bills, about Sophie presenting her science project at a school where most of her classmates probably had parents with graduate degrees and six-figure incomes. "What kind of scary noise does your car make?" he asked. "Like a dying whale," Sophie said with relish. "Mom says it's fine, but I think it might explode." "It's not going to explode," Emma said firmly. "It just needs some work." "Which we'll take care of when I get my next paycheck." Marcus made a mental note to have his mechanic take a look at Emma's car. Discreetly, of course. He was beginning to understand that Emma's pride was as fierce as her kindness. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Patel, the attending physician, entered with a chart and a professional smile. "Good morning, Emma. How are you feeling?" "Much better, ready to go home." "Let's have a look." Dr. Patel examined the cut on Emma's forehead and checked her reflexes with practiced efficiency. "The CT scan looks good, no signs of bleeding or swelling. But I want you to take it easy for the next few days. No work, lots of rest, and someone should check on you regularly for the next 48 hours. "I'll be fine," Emma said automatically. "Sophie and I take care of each other." Dr. Patel glanced at Sophie, who was now investigating the contents of Mrs. Chen's food containers with single-minded 7-year-old focus. "With respect, Ms. Rodriguez, your daughter shouldn't be responsible for monitoring your medical condition. Is there another adult who can stay with you?" Emma's face flushed with embarrassment. "I don't really have a— I mean, Mrs. Chen can check on us, but she has her own life, and I wouldn't want to impose." "I'll stay with them." The words were out of Marcus's mouth before he'd consciously decided to say them. Every logical part of his brain was screaming that this was a terrible idea. He had meetings, responsibilities, a company to run. But the thought of Emma going home to take care of herself and Sophie with a concussion she was clearly downplaying made something protective and fierce rise up in his chest. "Marcus, you don't have to—" Emma began. "I want to." He looked at Dr. Patel. "What exactly should I watch for?" As the doctor ran through the warning signs of complications, Marcus found himself taking mental notes with the same intensity he brought to board presentations. Severe headache, nausea, confusion, difficulty staying awake. He filed each symptom away, already planning how he'd reorganize his schedule to be available if Emma needed medical attention. "I really can't ask you to do that," Emma said after Dr. Patel left with orders for her discharge. "You must have work, obligations, nothing that can't wait." Marcus was surprised to realize this was true. For the first time in 15 years, something felt more important than sterling tech. Mrs. Chen, who had been listening to this exchange while feeding Sophie dumplings, made another of her indecipherable sounds. "Rich man wants to play house with pretty girl and her daughter. What could go wrong?" "Mrs. Chen," Emma said, mortified, "I speak truth. Rich men always have agenda. Question is what agenda?" She fixed Marcus with a stare that could have melted steel. "You hurt Emma or Sophie, I have very sharp knives and know how to use them." Marcus had faced down hostile corporate takeovers and congressional hearings, but Mrs. Chen's threat was somehow more intimidating than anything he'd encountered in the business world. "I understand," he said seriously, "and I have no intention of hurting either of them." Intention's easy to have, following through harder. But she nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. "Emma, you let rich man help. You too stubborn for own good, always trying to do everything alone. Sometimes it's okay to accept help." Emma looked like she wanted to argue, but Sophie chose that moment to bounce back onto the bed. "Can Marcus come see my science project presentation? It's today at 2 o'clock, and Mom was supposed to come, but now she's hurt and—" "Sweetheart, Marcus is a very busy man. I'm sure he has important things to do." Marcus looked at Sophie's hopeful face and felt something in his chest crack wide open. When was the last time someone had invited him to something that didn't involve quarterly projections or strategic partnerships? When was the last time he'd been wanted somewhere simply for himself, not for what he could provide? "I'd love to see your science project," he said, "if your mum thinks it's okay." Sophie threw her arms around his neck with the unself-conscious affection of childhood. "This is the best day ever. Wait until I tell Madison that my mom's boyfriend is coming to see my project." "Sophie," Emma began, but Marcus caught her eye and shook his head slightly. Let the kid have her fantasy, at least for now. The adult world would intrude soon enough. An hour later, Marcus found himself in the front seat of his Tesla, following Emma's directions to her apartment in the Greenwood neighborhood. She'd insisted on taking a cab from the hospital, not wanting to impose further on his time, but he'd convinced her to let him drive them by pointing out that Sophie was already buckled into his back seat, chattering excitedly about her science project. "Turn left at the next light," Emma said, wincing slightly as they hit a pothole. "It's the blue building on the right." Marcus pulled into the parking lot of a 1950s apartment complex that had seen better days. The building was clean but worn, with small balconies and windows that suggested one-bedroom units designed for people getting by rather than getting ahead. It was a far cry from his downtown penthouse, but somehow it felt more like home than anywhere he'd lived in years. "This is it," Emma said, gathering her purse and the bag of leftovers Mrs. Chen had insisted they take. "It's not much, but it's ours." "It looks perfect," Marcus said, and meant it. Sophie led them up 2 flights of stairs to apartment 2B, bouncing with excitement as Emma fumbled with her keys. "Wait until you see my room. I have glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and my desk is where I do my homework, and I have a picture of you and me at the zoo, Mom, remember?" The apartment was small but warm, furnished with mismatched pieces that spoke of careful budgeting and creative solutions. The walls were covered with Sophie's artwork, and what Marcus recognized as Emma's paintings, abstract pieces full of color and movement that seemed to capture emotions rather than specific images. "You're an artist," he said, studying a canvas that hung over the small dining table. Emma flushed. "It's just a hobby, something I do when I can't sleep." But Marcus could see it was more than that. The paintings were skilled, expressive, full of a raw honesty that reminded him of their conversation in the hospital. Emma poured her feelings onto canvas the way other people wrote in diaries. "They're beautiful," he said, and watched her face light up with the pleasure of someone whose art was rarely acknowledged. "Mum's the best painter in the world," Sophie announced. "She painted the mural in my room. Want to see?" Sophie's room was the explosion of color and creativity, every surface covered with books, toys, art supplies, and the detritus of an active 7-year-old's life. But it was the mural that took Marcus's breath away. Emma had painted an entire wall to look like an enchanted forest, complete with friendly dragons, magical creatures, and a little girl who looked remarkably like Sophie, having adventures among the trees. "She painted it when we first moved here," Sophie said proudly. "I told her I was scared of the dark, so she made me a forest full of friends to keep me company." Marcus stared at the mural, thinking about the wealth and privilege he'd grown up with, the expensive art that decorated his penthouse, the designer everything that surrounded him daily. None of it had ever been created with love, with the specific intention of making one small person feel safe and loved. "It's incredible," he said. "Mom says when I'm older, she's going to teach me how to paint like that. But first I have to learn about colors and perspective and stuff." Emma appeared in the doorway, still looking pale but determined. "Okay, kiddo, we need to get you ready for school. Your presentation is in a few hours, and you still need to pack your project." The next hour passed in a whirlwind of activity as Sophie gathered her science project materials, carefully constructed solar panels, a detailed poster board explaining renewable energy, and a presentation folder that was clearly the result of weeks of preparation. Marcus found himself pressed into service as a pack mule, carrying boxes and poster boards while Emma supervised despite her obvious fatigue. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked Emma quietly, while Sophie was in the bathroom. "You could stay home and rest. I can take her to school and watch her presentation." Emma looked at him like he'd suggested something impossible. "I'm not missing my daughter's science fair. She's been working on this for months." "But the doctor said to take it easy, not to lock myself in a padded room." Emma's tone was gentle but firm. "Sophie needs me there. That's more important than a headache." Marcus was beginning to understand that arguing with Emma about her daughter was pointless. Sophie came first, always, even when Emma was hurt and exhausted. It was admirable and frustrating in equal measure. They arrived at Greenwood Elementary 20 minutes before Sophie's presentation time. The school was buzzing with activity as parents and students set up science projects in the gymnasium. A chaos of poster boards and nervous energy that reminded Marcus of his early days pitching sterling tech to investors. Sophie's confidence evaporated the moment they walked into the gym. She pressed herself against Emma's side, suddenly shy in the face of all the other projects and parents. "What if I forget what to say?" she whispered. "What if nobody likes my project?" Emma knelt down to Sophie's eye level, ignoring the way the movement made her wince. "Hey, remember what we practiced? You know this stuff better than anyone. You built something amazing, and now you get to share it with people who want to learn." "But Madison's dad is a real scientist and Jacob's mom is an engineer, and I bet their projects are way better than mine." Marcus felt something clench in his chest as he watched Sophie struggle with the same insecurities that had driven him to work himself and his brother to death. The need to prove yourself, to be worthy, to earn love and approval through achievement, rather than simply existing. "Sophie," he said, crouching down beside Emma, "can I tell you something?" She nodded, eyes wide. "I've seen a lot of presentations in my life, business presentations, scientific presentations, all kinds. You know what makes the best ones special? It's not how much money someone spent or how fancy the equipment is. It's when the person presenting really cares about what they're sharing." "But what if I mess up?" "Then you keep going. Some of the best presentations I've ever seen had mistakes in them. It's not about being perfect. It's about sharing something you care about with people who want to learn from you." Sophie considered this seriously. "Do you really think my project is good enough?" Marcus looked at the solar panel house Sophie had constructed, a detailed model with working solar panels that actually powered LED lights, complete with a hand-drawn diagram explaining how solar energy converted to electricity. It was the work of a curious, dedicated mind, and it was better than half the presentations he'd seen from graduate students. "I think it's remarkable," he said honestly, "and I think you're going to do great." Sophie straightened up, some of her confidence returning. "Okay, but you have to promise to watch my whole presentation." "I wouldn't miss it." The next hour passed in a blur of science projects and proud parents. Marcus found himself genuinely interested in the displays around them: volcano models, plant growth experiments, demonstrations of basic physics principles. These kids were learning to think scientifically, to ask questions and test hypotheses, to find joy in discovery. When it was Sophie's turn to present, she walked to the front of her display area with her shoulders back and her chin up. Emma gripped Marcus's hand tightly as their daughter began to speak. "My name is Sophie Rodriguez, and my project is about solar energy." Sophie's voice was clear and confident as she explained her research, demonstrated her working model, and answered questions from the judges. She stumbled once, forgetting a word, but recovered gracefully and continued without losing her composure. Marcus found himself holding his breath as Sophie fielded questions from parents and other students. She knew her material inside and out, explaining complex concepts in simple terms that even the younger kids could understand. When a parent asked about the efficiency of different types of solar panels, Sophie launched into a detailed comparison that impressed even Marcus, who'd been following developments in renewable energy for Sterling Tech's sustainability initiatives. "She's incredible," he whispered to Emma. Emma's eyes were bright with tears of pride. "She is, isn't she? Sometimes I can't believe she's mine." When Sophie finished her presentation to enthusiastic applause, she ran over to them with a grin that could have powered the school. "Did you see? I remembered everything. And Mr. Johnson said my house was one of the most creative projects he'd seen." Emma hugged her daughter tightly. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You did amazing." "Marcus, did you really like it? You're not just saying that because you're Mom's friend?" Marcus looked down at this remarkable little girl who'd managed to capture his heart in the span of 24 hours. "Sophie, I thought your presentation was better than most of the ones I see from adults. You should be very proud of yourself." Sophie beamed and threw her arms around both Emma and Marcus, creating an impromptu group hug that felt more natural than it should have. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to be part of this, to be someone Sophie ran to with good news, someone Emma leaned on when things got difficult, someone who belonged in this small, loving family. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. After the science fair ended, they went to a nearby diner for celebratory ice cream, despite it being barely past 3 in the afternoon. Sophie chattered excitedly about her project, the other presentations she'd seen, and the ribbon she'd won for most creative use of renewable energy. "Can we frame my ribbon?" she asked Emma, "and put it next to my art from school?" "Of course, we'll stop at the store tomorrow and get a frame." Marcus watched Emma calculate the cost in her head, the small hesitation before agreeing that told him money was tighter than she wanted Sophie to know. He made another mental note. This one about art supplies and frames and all the small things that shouldn't be worries for a mother trying to encourage her daughter's achievements. "Marcus," Sophie said, interrupting his thoughts, "are you going to come to my next science project too?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus looked at Emma, who was studying her ice cream with sudden intensity, and realized they were at a crossroads. He could make some polite excuse about being busy, extract himself gracefully from their lives, and go back to his safe, predictable existence. Or he could take a leap of faith and see where this unprecedented situation might lead. "When is your next project?" he asked. "Not until the spring semester, but there's also the winter art show and the holiday concert, and Mom said maybe we can go see the Nutcracker this year if we save up enough money." Each item on Sophie's list was another small invitation, another chance to be part of something real and meaningful. Marcus thought about his usual holiday plans: charity galas, business dinners, carefully orchestrated social events that felt more like work than celebration. "I'd like to come to all of those things," he said, "if your mom thinks it's okay." Emma looked up from her ice cream, and Marcus saw surprise, hope, and fear warring in her expression. "Marcus, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to. But your work, your life, we're not exactly part of your usual world." "Maybe that's the point." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, marveling at how right it felt. "Maybe I need a different world." Sophie, who had been following this adult conversation with the intense focus of someone who understood its importance, even if she didn't grasp all the nuances, suddenly grinned. "Does this mean you're going to be my mom's boyfriend now?" The directness of the question made both Emma and Marcus laugh, breaking the tension that had been building. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that your mum and I are going to spend some time getting to know each other better, and I'm hoping we can be really good friends." "Good friends who hold hands and stay over when someone gets hurt?" Sophie asked with the devastating logic of childhood. "Sophie," Emma said weakly, "it's a fair question." Marcus squeezed Emma's hand gently. "And yes, I think we could be that kind of good friends." Sophie considered this seriously. "Okay, but if you're going to be Mom's friend, you have to know the rules." "What rules?" "Mom doesn't like it when people are loud and mean. She cries when she thinks I'm asleep, but only when she's really sad about something. She makes the best chocolate chip cookies, but she always burns the first batch, and she gets really scared during thunderstorms, so you have to hold her hand and tell her jokes until it stops raining." Each revelation was like a small gift, a glimpse into the private world Emma and Sophie shared. Marcus found himself filing away every detail, wanting to be worthy of the trust Sophie was placing in him. "Those sound like very important rules," he said solemnly. "I'll remember them." "Good." Sophie returned to her ice cream with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a crucial negotiation. As they walked back to Marcus's car, Sophie skipping ahead while Emma moved carefully beside him, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Contentment. Not the fleeting satisfaction of closing a major deal or the hollow pleasure of social recognition, but the deep, quiet happiness that came from being exactly where he was supposed to be, with people who mattered. "Thank you," Emma said quietly. "For what?" "For staying, for caring, for making Sophie feel special." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "For helping me remember what it feels like to not be alone." Marcus stopped walking, gently pulling Emma to face him. In the afternoon light, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way she was pushing through pain to give Sophie a normal day. But he could also see something else, a tentative hope, a willingness to trust that made his chest tight with emotion. "Emma," he said softly, "I haven't felt this human in 15 years. If anyone should be saying thank you, it's me." She smiled then, the real smile he'd first seen outside Molly's, and Marcus felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumble. He was in serious trouble, the best kind of trouble he'd ever imagined. Later that evening, after Sophie had been tucked into bed with her science fair ribbon carefully displayed on her nightstand, Marcus and Emma sat on her small balcony overlooking the apartment complex's courtyard. The Seattle evening was clear for once, stars visible between breaks in the ever-present cloud cover. "She's asleep," Emma reported, settling into the lawn chair beside him with a cup of tea. "Finally, I think the excitement of the day caught up with her." "She should be excited. That was an impressive presentation." "She gets that from her father." Emma's voice was carefully neutral. He was always good at explaining complicated things in simple terms. Marcus waited, sensing there was more to the story. Emma had mentioned Sophie's father leaving but hadn't provided details. He was curious, but he'd learned enough about her to know she'd share what she was comfortable sharing. "He's a professor at University of Oregon," Emma continued after a moment. "Physics. We met when I was auditing his class. I was working at a coffee shop near campus and taking art classes when I could afford them. He was brilliant, charming, everything I thought I wanted." "What happened?" "Reality." Emma's laugh held no humor. "Turns out dating a grad student and being married to someone without a degree are very different things." His colleagues made it clear they thought he'd married beneath himself, and eventually he started to agree with them. Marcus felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest, but this time it was protective rather than destructive. "He left you." "He left us. Sophie was 3. He said he needed to focus on his career, that being a father was holding him back from his potential." Emma's voice was steady, but Marcus could hear the old hurt underneath. "He sends a check every month and a birthday card twice a year. Sophie thinks he's busy saving the world with science." "And you let her think that. What's the alternative? Tell her that her father decided his career was more important than she was." Emma shook her head. "She'll figure out the truth when she's ready. For now she has enough love from the people who stayed." Marcus thought about his own father, distant and demanding but never absent. Whatever Walter Sterling's flaws, he'd never abandoned his sons. The idea of walking away from a child like Sophie made Marcus feel sick. "His loss," he said simply. "I used to think that was just something people said to make me feel better. But lately," Emma looked at him thoughtfully, "lately I'm starting to think maybe it's true." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the courtyard where a few teenagers were skateboarding under the streetlights. It was such an ordinary scene, nothing like the carefully curated environments Marcus usually inhabited, but somehow it felt more real than anything in his previous life. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said eventually. "Anything. What happens now? I mean this," she gestured between them. "Whatever this is. What happens when you go back to your real life? Your meetings and galas and billion-dollar company?" It was the question Marcus had been avoiding all day. The logical answer was that this was temporary, a brief detour from his usual routine, a momentary lapse in judgment that he'd eventually recover from. Emma was right that they came from different worlds. His life was complicated in ways she couldn't imagine, full of responsibilities and expectations, and people who depended on him. But when he thought about returning to that life without Emma and Sophie in it, something in his chest went hollow. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I know what I should do, what makes sense logically. But what I should do and what I want to do are two different things. What do you want to do?" The question was simple, but Marcus realized no one had asked him that in years. Every decision in his life was filtered through business considerations, public relations implications, fiduciary responsibilities. His wants hadn't been part of the equation since Danny died. "I want to have dinner with you and Sophie tomorrow night," he said. "I want to help her with her homework and listen to you read stories in funny voices. I want to fix your car and buy frames for Sophie's ribbons and learn how to make those chocolate chip cookies she mentioned." Emma's eyes widened with something that might have been hope or fear, possibly both. "I want to take you on real dates," Marcus continued, "where we talk about things that matter instead of networking and business strategies. I want to meet your friends and have you meet mine, if I can remember who they are outside of work contexts. Marcus, I want to wake up every morning knowing that I'm building something that matters, not just to shareholders but to real people. I want Sophie to keep looking at me like I hung the moon, and I want you to keep seeing something in me worth saving." Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "That's a lot of wanting for someone who spent 15 years not caring about anything. I know, it scares the hell out of me." "Good." Emma reached over and took his hand. "If it didn't scare you, I'd be worried you weren't taking it seriously." Marcus brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Even your company, especially my company. Sterling Tech was always about proving something, to myself, to my father, to everyone who doubted I could succeed. But this..." He looked at Emma, at her small apartment and her sleeping daughter, and the life they'd built together. "This feels like it's about building something instead of proving something. Does that make sense?" Emma smiled, and Marcus felt something settle into place in his chest, a sense of rightness he'd never experienced before. "Perfect sense," she said. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. Sophie and we're a package deal. I can't have someone in my life who's going to love me and tolerate her, or who's going to disappear when things get complicated. I wouldn't..." "You might not mean to, but she's 7 years old and she's already lost one father. I won't let her lose another one because I was selfish enough to want something for myself." The fierce protectiveness in Emma's voice reminded Marcus of the night they'd met, when she'd worried about a drunk stranger who'd just sent her to the hospital. Emma's capacity for love was matched only by her fierce determination to protect the people she cared about. "Emma, look at me." Marcus waited until she met his eyes. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I can't promise this won't be complicated or messy or harder than either of us expects. But I can promise you this, if I'm going to be in Sophie's life, I'm going to be all in. No halfway measures, no exit strategies, no backup plans. That's a big promise from someone who spent 15 years avoiding emotional commitments. Maybe that's why I can make it. I know what it costs to hold back, to protect yourself so thoroughly that you stop living. I'm tired of being half alive, Emma. You and Sophie make me want to be fully human again." Emma studied his face in the dim light from the courtyard, and Marcus held his breath while she weighed his words against everything she knew about protecting herself and her daughter. "Okay," she said finally. Okay. Let's try this. But we take it slow and we're honest with each other about everything. And the first time Sophie gets hurt because of this, we stop." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what she was offering him. Emma was trusting him with the most precious thing in her world, despite every logical reason to be cautious. "Deal," he said, sealing the promise with another gentle kiss to her hand. As they sat together in the Seattle evening, Marcus thought about the charity gala he'd missed the night before. The speeches about community investment and social responsibility that had felt so hollow. He'd spent years writing checks and shaking hands and telling himself he was making a difference in the world. But here, on a small balcony overlooking an ordinary apartment complex, holding hands with a waitress who painted murals for her daughter's bedroom and worried about car repairs, Marcus finally understood what making a difference actually meant. It wasn't about grand gestures or tax-deductible donations. It was about showing up. It was about caring enough about individual people to let them change you. It was about choosing love over safety, connection over control, hope over the certainty of disappointment. For the first time in 15 years, Marcus Sterling felt like he was exactly where he belonged. And if that made him a monster, the kind of monster who put people before profits, who chose messy human connection over pristine isolation, who let a 7-year-old science project matter more than a board meeting, then he was ready to embrace his monstrous nature completely. The man who had walked into Molly's pub in the rain was gone. In his place sat someone Emma and Sophie were teaching him to become, someone capable of love, worthy of trust, and finally, blessedly human. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the same spot on his office balcony, but everything had changed. The rain was still falling. This was Seattle, after all. But instead of feeling trapped behind glass walls, he felt connected to the life pulsing in the city below. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Don't forget we're making cookies tonight. Mum says you can't burn the first batch anymore because you're supposed to be learning." Marcus smiled, remembering the first time he'd tried to help with Emma's weekend baking tradition. He'd treated it like a business presentation, measuring ingredients with scientific precision and following the recipe exactly. The results had been technically perfect and completely soulless. It had taken weeks of practice to learn that the best cookies came from intuition, laughter, and accepting that some imperfection made things more beautiful, not less. "Mr. Sterling?" Rebecca's voice came through the intercom. "The board meeting is ready to begin. I'll be right there." Marcus straightened his tie and picked up the quarterly reports from his desk. But instead of the familiar anxiety that used to accompany these meetings, he felt calm. Sterling Tech was thriving under his new management philosophy, one that prioritized sustainable growth over rapid expansion, employee well-being over pure profit, and long-term vision over quarterly gains. The board hadn't been thrilled with all the changes initially. Walter Sterling had been particularly vocal about his son's newfound bleeding heart tendencies. But the results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction was at an all-time high, productivity had increased by 18%, and their latest product launch had exceeded projections by 30%. Turns out that when you treated people like human beings instead of resources, they did remarkable work. The boardroom was full of the usual suspects, venture capitalists, industry veterans, and family money that came with strong opinions about how businesses should be run. Marcus took his place at the head of the table and opened his presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. As you can see from the quarterly numbers, Sterling Tech has not only met our revised projections, but exceeded them across all major metrics." He clicked through slides showing revenue growth, market expansion, and customer satisfaction scores. But his mind was partially on the evening ahead. Emma was working late at Molly's tonight, covering for another server who was sick, which meant he'd be helping Sophie with her homework and making dinner. Last week, they'd attempted to recreate a recipe Sophie had found online for the world's best mac and cheese. The result had been marginally edible and completely hilarious, The sustainability initiatives have been particularly successful, Marcus continued, clicking to a slide showing their carbon reduction metrics. Our partnership with local renewable energy providers has not only reduced our environmental impact, but also created cost savings that we've been able to pass on to both employees and customers. Board member Harrison Webb, a fossil fuel investor who'd never liked Marcus's environmental policies, cleared his throat. All of this sounds very nice, Marcus, but what's the long-term strategy here? Are we running a business or a charity? It was the same question Webb asked at every meeting, and Marcus had the same answer. We're running a business that happens to give a damn about more than just profits. But at what cost? Webb pressed. These feel-good initiatives are expensive. The employee wellness programs, the environmental upgrades, the increased paid time off, none of that comes free. You're right, Harrison. It's not free, but it's an investment that pays returns in ways that don't always show up in quarterly reports. Marcus thought about his employees, many of whom he'd gotten to know personally since implementing his open-door policy. Sarah Chen in accounting was able to take 6 weeks off when her mother was diagnosed with cancer. Instead of losing a talented employee to stress and family obligations, she came back more loyal and productive than ever. David Rodriguez in marketing used our continuing education fund to get his MBA and immediately applied his new skills to a campaign that generated $2 million in revenue. Anecdotal evidence, Webb muttered. Statistical evidence, Marcus corrected, clicking to his next slide. Employee retention is up 42%. Sick days are down 30%. Internal promotions have increased by 60%, saving us millions in recruitment and training costs. Our customer satisfaction ratings have improved across every demographic, leading to increased repeat business and referrals. Marcus looked around the table at faces that ranged from impressed to skeptical. A year ago, he would have cared desperately about their approval. Now he cared more about doing the right thing. The bottom line, Marcus continued, is that Sterling Tech is more profitable than it's ever been, and we're achieving that success in a way that I can be proud of, in a way that honors the people who helped build this company. After the meeting ended, with grudging approval of his quarterly performance and continued grumbling about his methods, Marcus packed up his laptop and headed for the elevator. He had somewhere important to be. Sophie's elementary school was hosting its winter art show, and Marcus had promised to be there. In the past 3 months, he'd attended more school events than he had in his entire childhood. Soccer games, school plays, parent-teacher conferences, fundraising bake sales. Each one had taught him something new about being part of a community. He arrived at Greenwood Elementary to find the hallways transformed into an art gallery, with student work displayed on every available wall, and proud parents wandering from exhibit to exhibit. The energy was infectious, pure joy and creativity, without the competitive edge that characterized most events in Marcus's usual social circle. "Marcus, over here!" Sophie's voice cut through the crowd, and Marcus turned to see her waving frantically from beside a display case near the main office. She was wearing her best dress, a blue flowered number that Emma had bought for the occasion, and her hair was pulled back with clips that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. "There you are," Emma said as he approached, rising on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek. She looked beautiful in a simple black dress that probably came from Target, but fit her like it was custom-made. "We were starting to think you'd gotten lost. Board meeting ran late, sorry." Marcus looked at the display case, where Sophie's latest artwork was prominently featured. "Sophie, this is incredible." Sophie beamed with pride as she pointed to her contribution, a mixed-media piece that combined painting, collage, and what appeared to be actual leaves and flowers pressed under glass. The subject was a family of 3 standing in front of a house, with a garden full of solar panels and flowers. "It's called My New Family," Sophie explained. "See, that's you, and that's Mom, and that's me. And that's our house with the solar panels from my science project, and the flowers are real ones that Mrs. Chen helped me press." Marcus felt something catch in his throat as he studied the artwork. In Sophie's vision, they weren't just 3 people who happened to spend time together. They were a unit, a family, complete and whole. The Marcus in the painting was smiling, his arms around both Emma and Sophie, looking more at peace than Marcus could ever remember feeling in real life. "Do you like it?" Sophie asked, a hint of nervousness creeping into her voice. "Sophie, I love it more than any piece of art I've ever seen." Marcus crouched down to her level. "Can I tell you a secret?" She nodded eagerly. "I've never been in a family portrait before. This is my first one, and it's perfect." Sophie's smile could have lit up the entire school. She threw her arms around Marcus's neck, and he held her tight, marveling at how this small person had managed to heal parts of his heart he didn't know were broken. "Okay, you two," Emma said, laughing through what looked suspiciously like tears. "People are staring." Marcus looked around to see that they had indeed attracted attention from other parents who were watching their small family tableau with expressions ranging from curious to warmly approving. 6 months ago, being the center of attention would have made Marcus deeply uncomfortable. Now he found he didn't care who was watching. They spent the next hour touring the art show, admiring finger paintings and clay sculptures, and the earnest creativity that poured from every piece. Sophie introduced Marcus to her classmates and teachers with obvious pride, and Marcus found himself genuinely engaged in conversations about art techniques and creative inspiration with 7-year-olds. "Mr. Marcus," one of Sophie's classmates asked as they stood in front of a display of abstract paintings, "are you really a billionaire?" "Madison!" Sophie hissed, mortified by her friend's directness. "It's okay," Marcus said, amused by the question. "Yes, I suppose I am." Madison studied him with the intense focus of childhood. "You don't look like a billionaire." "What do billionaires look like?" "Mean. Like the bad guy in movies who wants to tear down the playground to build a parking lot." Marcus laughed, remembering his own ruthless business practices from not so long ago. "Well, I promise I have no plans to tear down any playgrounds." "Good. Sophie said you're nice and you help her with her math homework and you can't cook, but you're learning." "Sophie talks about me, does she?" "All the time. She says you make her mom laugh and you're teaching her about business, and you bought her a telescope so she can look at stars." Each revelation was a small gift, evidence of the life he was building with Emma and Sophie. Marcus glanced over at Emma, who was examining a display of student poetry with the focused attention she brought to everything Sophie created. "Madison," he said conspiratorially, "can I tell you another secret?" She nodded eagerly. "Sophie and her mom make me happy in a way I never knew was possible, so I guess you could say I'm the luckiest billionaire in the world." Madison considered this seriously. "That's good. Sophie deserves someone who makes her happy. Her dad made her sad sometimes, out of the mouths of babes." Marcus felt the familiar anger at Sophie's father, but it was tempered now by gratitude. If David Rodriguez hadn't been fool enough to abandon his family, Marcus never would have found them. "Well," he told Madison, "I plan to make both Sophie and her mom as happy as I possibly can, for as long as they'll let me." As the art show wound down and families began heading home, Marcus found himself walking hand in hand with Emma, while Sophie skipped ahead, her ribbon for Most Creative Mixed Media clutched in her free hand. "Thank you," Emma said quietly. "For what this time?" "For showing up, for caring about the things that matter to her, for making her feel like she's worth celebrating." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Emma, Sophie is the most remarkable kid I've ever met. Anyone who doesn't think she's worth celebrating is an idiot. Even when she gets paint on your expensive shirts and asks you impossible questions about physics and expects you to remember the names of all her stuffed animals. Especially then." They'd reached Marcus's car, where Sophie was already bouncing impatiently by the passenger door. "Can we get ice cream, please? I want a ribbon and everything." Emma started to protest it was a school night and Sophie still had homework, but Marcus caught her eye and shook his head slightly. Sometimes celebration was more important than routine. "Ice cream sounds perfect," he said, "but then homework and early bedtime." Sophie cheered and scrambled into the back seat, immediately launching into a detailed analysis of every piece of art they'd seen and which ones she thought deserved ribbons. Her chatter filled the car as they drove to their favorite ice cream shop, the same diner where they'd celebrated her science fair victory months ago. As they sat in their usual booth, Sophie with chocolate chip cookie dough, Emma with vanilla, Marcus with coffee. Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed. 3 months ago, he'd been a man who measured success in stock prices and market share. Now success looked like Sophie's grin when she bit into her ice cream, or the way Emma's eyes lit up when she talked about a painting she was working on, or the simple pleasure of knowing he had somewhere to be on a Tuesday evening that had nothing to do with business. "Marcus," Sophie said, interrupting his thoughts, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Are you going to marry my mom?" The question was delivered with the same casual tone Sophie might use to ask about the weather, but Marcus saw Emma freeze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Sophie," Emma began, but Marcus held up a hand. "It's okay." He looked at Sophie seriously. "Why do you ask?" "Because Jimmy Morrison's mom is getting married to his stepdad next month, and he gets to be the ring bearer. And I was thinking, if you married Mom, maybe I could be the flower girl." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a settling into place of feelings he'd been too scared to examine too closely. The truth was, he had been thinking about marriage. Late at night, when Emma fell asleep in his arms, or early in the morning, when he watched her make coffee for all 3 of them, or during quiet moments like this, when Sophie asked questions that cut straight to the heart of what they were building together. "Well," he said carefully, "if I were going to marry your mom, and I'm not saying I am, because that's something she and I would need to talk about first, but if I were going to, you would definitely be the flower girl." Sophie's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? And could I wear a fancy dress and throw rose petals and everything?" "Absolutely. The fanciest dress we could find and all the rose petals you could throw." Emma was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Marcus, don't panic," he said gently. "I'm just saying if it happened, Sophie would have the most important job in the whole wedding." But the truth was, Marcus wasn't just hypothetically speaking. Sitting there in their favorite diner, watching Sophie plan a wedding that existed only in her imagination, he realized he wanted nothing more than to make her fantasy a reality. Emma Rodriguez and her remarkable daughter had taken a man who'd forgotten how to feel and taught him what it meant to be alive. They'd shown him that success wasn't about what you accumulated, but about what you gave. That strength came from vulnerability, that the best way to honor the dead was to embrace the living. 3 months ago, Marcus had been afraid of becoming a monster. Now he understood that the real monster had been the man who'd spent 15 years hiding from love, protecting himself so thoroughly that he'd stopped living. If loving Emma and Sophie made him a monster, the kind who put family before profit, who chose hope over cynicism, who believed in second chances and new beginnings, then he'd embrace his monstrous nature completely. "Sophie," he said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, "what would you say if I told you I was planning to ask your mom a very important question soon?" Sophie's eyes went wide. "The marriage question." "The marriage question. I would say it's about time." Sophie launched herself across the table to hug him, knocking over his coffee in the process. "Mom, did you hear? Marcus is going to ask you the marriage question." Emma looked shell-shocked. "Marcus, we haven't talked about... it's only been 3 months and..." "Emma." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, coffee dripping onto the floor around them. "I know it's fast. I know it's complicated. I know there are 1,000 logical reasons to wait. But I've spent 15 years being logical, and it nearly killed me. For the first time in my adult life, I'm making a decision with my heart instead of my head." Marcus looked into Emma's eyes, seeing his own hopes and fears reflected there. "I love you. I love Sophie. I want to be part of this family you've built, officially and permanently, and with rings and flower girls and everything that makes it real." Emma was crying now, tears streaming down her face while Sophie bounced in her seat with excitement. "You love us?" "More than I knew it was possible to love anything. You saved my life, Emma. Both of you. You took a man who'd forgotten how to be human, and you reminded me what living actually means." "I love you too," Emma whispered. "I was just too scared to say it first." "So is that a yes to the marriage question?" Sophie demanded. Emma laughed through her tears. "That depends. Marcus Sterling, are you asking?" Marcus looked at this woman who'd seen him at his worst and somehow found something worth loving. At her daughter who'd taught him that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. At the life they'd created together out of broken pieces and second chances. "Emma Rodriguez," he said loud enough for half the diner to hear, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift you and Sophie have given me?" "Yes," Emma said, and then louder, "Yes." Sophie cheered, the other diners applauded, and Marcus felt something click into place in his soul, the sound of a life finally fully lived. 6 months later, Marcus stood at the altar of a small church in Greenwood, watching Emma walk down the aisle in a simple white dress that made her look like something out of a fairy tale. Sophie preceded her, carefully scattering rose petals with the intense concentration of someone who took her flower girl duties very seriously. The wedding was everything Marcus's previous social events hadn't been. Warm, genuine, full of people who were there because they loved Emma and Sophie and wanted to celebrate their happiness. Jerry had closed Molly's for the evening, so the whole bar staff could attend. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and occasionally scolding people for being too loud. Even some of Marcus's employees had come, people he'd gotten to know as individuals, rather than just names on an organizational chart. As Emma reached the altar and took his hands, Marcus thought about the night they'd met outside Molly's, when he'd been a man drowning in his own isolation. He'd walked into that dive bar looking for whiskey, and found salvation instead. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today to witness the marriage of Marcus and Emma, and to celebrate the family they are creating together." Marcus barely heard the traditional words, too focused on Emma's face, on the way she was looking at him like he was her greatest dream come true. When it came time for vows, he'd thrown away the careful written speech and decided to speak from his heart. "Emma," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "3 months ago, I was a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be alive. I was successful, wealthy, accomplished, and completely empty. Then I met you outside a dive bar in the rain, and you reminded me that kindness to strangers matters, that showing up is more important than winning, that love is worth the risk of being hurt." Emma's eyes were bright with tears, and Sophie, standing beside them as junior maid of honor, was practically vibrating with excitement. "You and Sophie taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to show up for each other every day, about building something beautiful together, out of whatever pieces you have. You took a monster who'd spent 15 years hiding from human connection, and you loved me back to life." Marcus paused, looking out at the assembled crowd, their community, their chosen family, the people who'd helped them both become who they were meant to be. "So I promise you this, I will show up every day for the rest of my life. I will choose love over fear, connection over control, hope over cynicism. I will be the father Sophie deserves, the husband you deserve, the man Danny would be proud to call his brother." Emma's vows were equally heartfelt, promising to help him stay human, to trust him with her heart and her daughters, to build a life together that honored both their past struggles and their future dreams. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed Emma with all the love and gratitude and wonder that had been building in his chest for months. Sophie cheered, the congregation applauded, and Mrs. Chen loudly declared that it was about time these two stopped being stupid and got married. At the reception held in the community center where Sophie attended after-school programs, Marcus found himself surrounded by a kind of joy he'd never experienced. This wasn't the polite, networking-focused socializing of charity galas. This was celebration in its purest form, people dancing badly to music played too loud, eating cake that was homemade rather than professionally catered, laughing until their sides hurt. "Having fun?" Emma asked, appearing at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. "The best fun of my life," Marcus said, and meant it completely. They watched Sophie teaching some of the other kids how to do the electric slide, her flower girl dress swirling around her as she moved. Jerry was attempting to DJ with a playlist that jumped randomly from Motown to Taylor Swift to classic rock, and somehow it worked perfectly. "No regrets?" Emma asked quietly. Marcus thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, isolated, bitter, so afraid of being hurt that he'd stopped living. That man would have looked at this scene and seen chaos, inefficiency, a waste of time and resources. Now all he could see was love made visible, community in action, the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. "Only one," he said. Emma's face fell slightly. "What?" "That it took me so long to find you both." Emma's smile was radiant as she stood on her toes to kiss him again. "Worth the wait," she murmured against his lips. As the evening wound down and guests began heading home, Marcus found himself holding a sleeping Sophie while Emma gathered up wedding gifts and leftover cake. This was his family now. Not the family he'd been born into, but the one he'd chosen and been chosen by in return. "Ready to go home, husband?" Emma asked, the word still new and wonderful on her tongue. Home. 6 months ago, home had been a sterile penthouse filled with expensive things that meant nothing to him. Now home was wherever Emma and Sophie were. The small apartment in Greenwood that they'd already outgrown, the new house they were looking at in a neighborhood with good schools and big trees, or eventually the place they'd build together from scratch. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Marcus said. As they drove through the quiet Seattle streets, Sophie fast asleep in her car seat, and Emma's hand warm in his, Marcus thought about monsters and redemption, about the different ways a person could be saved. He'd spent 15 years believing that caring about people made you vulnerable, that love was a weakness that would inevitably destroy you. But Emma and Sophie had taught him the truth. Love wasn't what made you a monster. Love was what made you human. The monster Marcus had feared becoming. The one who put people before profits, who chose messy human connection over pristine control, who believed in second chances and new beginnings, wasn't a monster at all. He was just a man who'd finally learned how to live, and as Marcus Sterling drove his new family home through the rain-washed streets of Seattle, he couldn't imagine wanting to be anything else.